In the name of God, who is the most compassionate, we'll start now the first session of the third day. This morning we will be discussing problematic issues in the Arab-American relations, Palestine and Iraq as an example. In fact, for decades we had one problematic issue with the United States, which was the Palestinian issue. The invasion of Iraq has made two issues, and these two issues have been casting their shadow on many other issues and clouding the relations with the United States. In this morning's session, we have four panelists. We have Dr. Marwan Bishara, Dr. Osama Abu-Irshaid, and Ustad Haifa Zangana, and Mazen Ramadan. And each will be presenting. The first paper will be Palestine in the American Foreign Policy by Dr. Marwan Bishara. And Dr. Bishara, he produces and presents a program on Al Jazeera English called Empire, and has many research papers in English and Arabic. And now you have 15 minutes, Dr. Bishara. Thank you, Dr.
Since the paper has been written in English, and since I'm introduced as working with Al Jazeera English, and I worked at an American university, I think I'm going to speak in English. إذا ما في عندكم مانع. The paper tries to do a very simple task. It tries to find a paradigm. It tries to arrive at a pattern in the American approach towards Palestine. In two words, the paper shows why, although the policy towards Palestine has changed over the last 100 years, the calculus behind the policy has not changed over the last 100 years. So while the policy changed, the calculus remained constant from Wilson in 1914 to Obama in 2014. So what we do is I take basically an bird's view over 100 years of policy. And actually, as Richard Murphy said yesterday, the policy did start in 1914. I mean, any signs of policy did start in 1914 under Wilson. And the calculus really starts there. So what the paper does is it will basically go over, and I will just summarize them for you, 15 points in 15 minutes. Or the main subtitles, if you will. And these are the 5 phases: the interwar, post-Second World War, Cold War, post-Cold War, and post-9/11. And there are 4 factors that I look at, and they are the Israeli lobby in the United States, Israel's strategic posture, Arab strategic weight, and US national security interests globally. And then I look at 3 approaches. The first was the indifference, the largely indifference towards the Palestinians. Second, the largely or greatly hostile towards the Palestinians, notably the PLO. And the third phase is the co-optation of the Palestinians, notably from 1988 onwards. And within these 3 approaches, there were also three basic characteristics, if you will, to the approaches. One is the instrumental approach, and one is the utilitarian approach, and third is the contradictory approach. And last but not least, there were then 2 losers in the US-Palestine relations: the United States and the Palestinians. They were both the losers. And then we end with this one last thing, which is the paradigm. So what is the paradigm? What is that calculus that goes into the decision-making process in the United States towards Palestine. Now here, two caveats. One, I will not speak about the peace process. That's not part of what the paper is trying to do. And two, I don't do diplomacy. And I'm not a historian, so there's no, blah, 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 Baker said, Schultz said, Rice said. That's not interesting, because I think all of the diplomacy and who visits who is really more of a reflection of the power structure and the power calculus that goes into the relationship. The most puzzling thing about Palestine and U.S. foreign policy is that you could not implement any of the foreign relations theories that we usually would teach our students about any kind of relationship between two countries, because Palestine was not a state, and even when it did become and was recognized, the United States does not recognize Palestine as a state and does not deal with it as such. Hence, what would be the approach and what theories or what paradigm can we introduce to understanding the U.S. Policy towards Palestine? And here, the paper takes an interdisciplinary approach. It tries to look both at the politics within Washington, at the strategy within the national security interests and its policy in the global Middle East. And as I said, it looks into the two main components, Israel's strategic posture and the Arab strategic weight or leverage when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. Now, why is it constant and why has it been changing? It has been changing because, of course, between the various phases that I just named, the 5 phases, the policy has changed according to global U.S. approaches to the region and global U.S. approach to the world. So the Cold War was, of course, different from the interwar period. And the post-Cold War was, again, different because U.S. policy changed, U.S. strategy changed, and the Middle East was going to become part of that change. But the calculus behind the policy did not change. And these are, as I said, the 4 factors. What the United States did throughout the last 100 years was balance the 4 factors that I just mentioned. So when Israel lobby was strong or becoming stronger, Israel's strategic weight was becoming important, and the Arab strategic leverage, for example, was weaker, the U.S. policy towards Palestine, hence, of course, went towards more of an Israeli vision, more of an Israeli doctrine, more of an Israeli understanding of the Palestinian issue. But when the Arabs proposed or were able to pose a strategic leverage or strategic weight, and the Israeli lobby retrenched, we could see that the American policy took a different position towards Palestine. Now, here, globally, the American position on my 3 approaches that I mentioned, and we don't give it too much emphasis in the interwar period because it was really largely indifferent. Palestine was not important for America until the Cold War. The Jewish question was important, Jewish homeland was important, the Palestinians were not important. And as Murphy mentioned yesterday, from Wilson 1914, you had 2 basically very small influential factors going on. His evangelical beliefs and his very good friend Judge Brandes, who was an American Zionist who believed that there should be a homeland for the Jews, and eventually between 1914 and 1917 convinced President Wilson to take that position to the opposition of his own State Department. So from then on, that sort of growth of the Jewish voice and the Israel lobby voice was to be complemented by Israel's own strategic growth in terms of its strategic posture, in terms of as being an American client or an American ally, if you will, in the region. That posited very heavily on the American decision-making towards Palestine. So in that sense, Palestine was actually the present absentee, meaning the Palestinians themselves did not pose any particular weight on American decision-making. It was either Israel and Israel lobby, or it was the Arabs. But Palestinians per se, we did not, and Palestine per se was not an important strategic issue for the United States. I mean, Palestine as the homeland, Palestine as the state, Palestine as the territory was not strategically important to the United States. In fact, it's from there that we can deduce a very important nuance. While Israel is a strategic imperative for the United States, Israel's occupation of Palestine is not a strategic imperative for the United States. The United States does not have a strategic priority for Palestine to be occupied by Israel, or the other way around. It depends on the calculus that goes into it, meaning what the Palestinians and the Arabs can do and what Israel and its lobby could do in the process. And that created the contradictory approach in the US foreign policy. And the contradictory approach is very simple. In fact, legally, the United States took the position throughout, from 1967 at least, onward, that the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem are occupied territories, and that UN Security Council resolutions are the basis for our negotiations. Did not accept the Israeli annexations of East Jerusalem, and continuously voted for those UN Council resolutions. And in fact, in 2 cases, did not vote for, meaning it did not veto, the implementation of the 4th Geneva Convention in the occupied Palestinian territories. So consistently, the American diplomatic posture and legal approach was consistent since 1967. But on the other hand, strategically speaking, it allowed Israel to get away with changing and violating that international law in Palestine as it pleased. So Israel expanded settlements, Israel repressed, built walls, annexed East Jerusalem, and the United States did very little to stop it from doing so. So that was the contradictory approach. Legally speaking, it remained consistent, but strategically speaking, it allowed Israel to do whatever. And why did that happen? And here I'll try to end with some sort of an overall conclusion. Palestine was instrumental and utilitarian for the United States as a superpower in the Middle East. It became a testing ground, if you will, a laboratory of sort for the major American ideas for the Middle East and actually for the world. The first one started after the peace process, and that when the Middle East, under the Clinton doctrine of open markets and open democracy post-Cold War, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and all that sort of stuff, the Middle East had to fit into that. So under Baker before, under Clinton later, Israel-Palestine had to be part of this new global approach. And that global approach meant open market, more stability, less war, and allow Palestine to become the laboratory for the new dependency, the new economic dependency, where you would even test the kind of Micheliadores that we've seen on the Mexican-American borders, in the Gaza-Israel border, and in the West Bank-Israel border. So a new economic model was being tested in Palestine for that purpose. It actually later on succeeded perhaps more in Jordan, but it certainly was the testing ground. Instrumentally speaking, Palestine was always a place where Israel would experiment with its military and its strategic and its repressive tools that the United States would benefit from. So if you remember, after 2003, we heard many, many reports about how America was using Israel's own repressive tools in Palestine to applicate in Iraq, which we'll probably get to Iraq later. But certainly the instrumentalization of Palestine as a laboratory for new asymmetrical warfare was very important for the United States. So whether by design or by default, Palestine was a laboratory for asymmetrical warfare that the United States would benefit from, and the American military would be trained by Israel's own tactics in order to applicate in Iraq. Where does that take us? That takes us to a very simple conclusion. The calculus of war, the calculus of American policy towards Palestine is not static. It's fixed, but it's not static. The policy could change. And if the calculus within it changes, the policy could change. It is not irreversible that Palestine needs to continue to be occupied by Israel. The US could change its policy on Palestine if the calculus, if the Arab and the Palestinian strategic weight changes, if the Arab and strategic leverage changes, because America does not have direct national interest in Palestine per se. It has national interest in the Middle East, but not in Palestine. If we change the calculus in the Middle East, the policy in Palestine will change. So what is that paradigm? For America's supporters, The paradigm is very simple. America is a benevolent superpower. And it has these allies in the region, the Saudis, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and the Israelis, and it tries to make everyone happy. So it enters into the peace process, and it tries to take the Saudi and the Egyptian considerations in mind, as well as the Israeli ones, and it just acts as a benevolent superpower. It's the sponsor of the means, with Israel perhaps putting more pressure. The other understanding of that paradigm comes from America's detractors in the Middle East, and that's what the Palestinian perspective it's going to be summarized. It is not just a simple sponsor. It is not the benevolent one that will support the Salam Fayyad type of government that will work both as a good businessman and as a good security force. It will oversee the Dayton forces that will lay down the new way to fight terrorism and asymmetrical warfare, and as well as the business. The last paradigm is, an understanding from America's detractors, is as such that, in fact, America is seen as, and don't be shaken by that. It's actually meant as a sociological construct, not as some, movie from The Godfather. Although there's a good bunch of ways to compare with The Godfather. It's seen as a mafiosi system. That Washington acts like the Godfather in a mafiosi system. So Israel is allowed, as the client, as the thug in the region, to do whatever it wants in Palestine and occupy and bomb Syria and bomb Tunisia and bomb Lebanon and violate Saudi airspace and bomb Iraq and threaten to bomb Iran. And the sponsor, the patron, is the United States. And the United States presumably has leverage on its little client, Israel. So the Arabs and the Palestinians come around and go to the Godfather and say, please help us with your little, thug, because we need help. And if you help us, we will be nicer to you, and we will say, okay, sir, and you are our Godfather. So we, the allies, the clients, we will, happily pay our dues and buy your weapons and give you oil cheaply and accept your designs upon us if you will just restrain your little client Israel. That ended up being the paradigm. It's actually a mafiosi paradigm where, for the Palestinians and the Arabs, as the detractors of Washington's policy in the Middle East, it sees that Washington policy in Palestine is more built on a mafiosi system than it is as a benevolent superpower. And hence, either you go along with Washington, play along, and accept that Washington has leverage in Israel, and hence enter a peace process, whereby Israel becomes a sponsor, America becomes a sponsor, and pressures Israel to make compromises in Palestine, and so the Arabs will rally and become supporters of the Godfather, or they don't. And my last 30 seconds end up with Obama. Obama is the Al Pacino of the American politics. He said, every time I try to get out of this business, they bring me back in to the business. He wanted to extract himself from the Middle East in terms of the war mentality, in terms of Israel's vision. He wanted to extract himself from Israel occupation of Palestine. He wanted to change that policy. But like Al Pacino, apparently he failed. He's drawn back in, and we're back to stuck with the same paradigm. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marwan, for the things that you have referred to that require a lot of deepening and enlightening for the public opinion about this tripartite relationship. I think there's a major power that we have not used very well, which is our geographic position, which is very rich, full of energy, full of commerce. It might increase the leverage that was referred to by Dr. Marwan. The second paper will be presented by Dr. Osama Abu-Irshaid. It will be the reality of political settlement between Israel and the Palestinians and its prospects under Obama administration. Dr. Osama is a researcher, non-resident researcher in the center, and he has co-authored 2 books about Hamas and the Israeli-Jordanian treaty, and he has obtained his master's degree from Northeastern Illinois. from Chicago, United States, and his PhD in political science and philosophy from Loughborough University in Britain. I give him 15 minutes. Thank you, Dr. Abdulwahab. Thank you, Dr. Marwan. I will continue what Dr. Bishara said when he referred to administration Obama's administration, its attempts to change the American policies towards the peace peace issue and the settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I will try to answer a central question, which is, has Obama really attempted or tried to change the American foreign policy regarding the peace settlement between Israel and Palestine? Has he really attempted so? Did he really try to change the American approach in its policies? This is the central question that I'll try to speak about. But this cannot be done unless we pose some other secondary questions to answer that question. The secondary questions that I want them also to be clear in our minds are about the background that pushed Obama. Yes, Obama did try to change things, but were these attempts actually radical, different attempts than what happened before? But it's all linked to the subjective and objective background that pushed Obama to try to strike a deal of peace during his two first years in power. The second question is, had Obama really taken a different attitude regarding Israel compared to other presidents? Third question is, why did his efforts failed just as other administrations that failed to achieve anything? And there is a main difference between supporting Israel strategically and between supporting occupation. And then the last point is related to the Palestinian past. Is there any reason that to support the Palestinians? There are many hopes and many things waited from Obama when he came to power, but so far we have seen nothing practical from him. Now we are speaking about Obama's presidency after 6 years in the White House. We are not talking about his first year. No, so I think he only has 2 years to go in his post. Obama came to power. I'm speaking about his efforts. He came to power, or he was elected on the basis of a central promise he had made. The central promise that, unlike the Bush administration, he will not postpone the peace settlement of the Middle East until the end of his mandate, as Bush did. He promised that he will begin immediately, but here we are. The reality is that we have not achieved the achieved that he promised that was not achieved. Why? This is a central point that we should remember while we do the analysis. It is about the personal weight and the moral weight and political and historical and strategic weight of the United States in Israel. Of Israel in the United States. Israel has a very big weight inside the politics of the United States, inside the country, and this must be taken into consideration whenever we hope anything that might come out from any president, American president or else. This weight has stipulated that it is immoral to abandon or give up on Israel, because Israel is considered that it's a ship that is sailing in a fierce sea with storms and everything, and has no one to help it. That should not be abandoned. Such a ship should not be abandoned in such a mid of such a sea. And in fact, especially that Israel is in a region of dictatorships. Of course, there is a historical background for this idea, but I will not go into the details of that. But we must only speak about the Zionist lobby. In the first day, there was a lot of talk about the Zionist lobby in the United States, and some of the interventions, although I respect them all, said that there is a marginalization of the role of the and of the strength of the Zionist role in lobby's role in United States. In fact, the Zionist lobby, does not monopolize the American foreign policies, but has a lot of influence on it concerning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and a lesser influence on formulating the American policies regarding the Middle East. Anyone who says that the Zionist lobby does not have such a weight is underestimating the real facts and reality of the politics in the United States. But the lobby, Zionist lobby, cannot by itself do take all these roles. It has alliances and coalitions on the media, political levels, and how to present and speak about this conflict. All these factors contribute in establishing and reinforcing the Zionist lobby in the United States. The third reason is related to the nature of the political life in the USA. The political life in Washington allow for the exploitation of one organized party of the foreign policies or any other policies that is of interest to a particular lobby. In fact, because there's a lot of influence that they have, for example, in different aspects. Obama tried, for example, to stop the spread of weapons in the United States after the big shootings that took place in schools and lately in California. But because there is this arms lobby in the United States, all his efforts failed, although the majority of the public opinion in the United States want to put some restrictions on the possession of arms. But having an organized lobby has given the strength to this lobby that overcame the majority of the people. In Israel's case, the majority of the public opinion is not against Israel, but because there is no one to stop them, they have had very much a big influence on the foreign policy of the United States. So Israel is not influence is not a partisan issue. No, because Israel is not partisan. Because regardless who is governing United States, and I remember during the elections of 2001, Rami accused Mubarak that he wants to kill Israel. We found that Obama himself was the administration that gave most of aid to Israel. It is Barack Obama's. So it is not a partisan issue for as far as Israel is concerned. Now we go back to the central question: did Obama try to change things? Yes. When he came to the presidency, and in an interview with a number of the Jewish community in July 2009, he said he wanted to change the Israeli behavior on the ground because he said things should not go on like they were. And in June 2012, he said that he discovered something after 3 years in presidency. He said that peace is difficult, so he found himself in a bigger problem. Now we speak about the motive that pushed Obama to try to put pressure or to produce a sort of peace agreement in Israel, between Israel and the Palestinians. Because saying that USA is a neutral party is not objective. There are three factors contradictory ones that are involved in Obama's motives to try to change the American-Israeli relations and to achieve peace. The first one is the intellectual and political background of Obama. Historically speaking, Obama had early positions that were sympathetic with the Palestinians and the right of Palestinians, especially since 1997 and 2004 when he was a Senate in Illinois state. The second factor is related to his personal will or wish that to be the president who will go into history for having achieved peace between Israel and Palestinians. And the third part is an objective one, which is that there is an interest for the United States that there should be a settlement agreement in the Arab region, and that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should not continue. I don't want to go into all the details, but about the subjective one, I said at some time Obama did have a different position. 2007, when a number of statements were used against him. For example, when he was candidate for the Congress in 2000, he had criticized Bill Clinton for having put pressure on the Palestinians in Camp David and not on the Israelis. And also in 2004, there were some statements he made criticizing the separation wall built by Israel in the West Bank. And during the primary elections of the Democratic Party in 2007, he also made a famous statement in Iowa, in which he said there's no people that have suffered so much as the Palestinian people. This has led to a storm of criticism against him. So that's why the second day he corrected the statement. He said that what I meant is that no people has suffered as much as Palestinian people because of the bad behaviors and positions of its own leadership, their own leadership. So Obama is a person who can accommodate and can give preference to the pragmatic aspects and to the moral ones. That's why he changed easily when after being a candidate to the Senate. Once he entered the Senate in 2005, he discovered that one of the pillars of political life in Washington is to protect Israel and to be with Israel. So he went along with this general lines in the that's why he approved the Israeli war against Lebanon in 2006. And his record of election and his vote was clear that it was in favor of Israel. And when he began to express his wish to present himself for the presidency, there was this famous statement that he made in June 2008 when he wanted to weaken all the arguments against him about Israel. He said that he agrees. He said that Jerusalem is the unified capital of Israel. But in principle, and he said this, Obama also tried to compare his experience as a Kenyan refugee son, and he also tried to justify his position against the war in Iraq because that was in the interest of Israel, and that he also to justify his position for peace, saying that it is in the interest of Israel. So so Obama was in fact tamed, so to speak, after being president, politically tamed, or he tamed himself subjectively, and he was tamed by others, realistically speaking. So there are so many contradictions inside the positions of Obama to the extent that his advisors were changed. So some of them were with Israel, some of them were very close to Israel, etc. But after his first presidency or her mandate, he put a lot of pressure on Israel. The first day he went into the White House on the 1st of January 2009, the first thing he did was he called a number of the leaders of the Middle East, Hosni Mubarak, King Abdullah of Jordan, Ehud Olmert, who had resigned, and also Mahmoud Abbas to assure them all that he's very much interested in the settlement. Then, second day, he went to the State Department to appoint George Mitchell as a special envoy to the Middle East. And this was not well accepted by the Zionist lobby because they consider George Mitchell someone who is not does not take sides or supports the lobby, the Zionists, because as a senator, his votes, although his votes always been were in favor of Israel, but nevertheless, one of the Zionists said that Mitchell believes that America should be neutral and an honest mediator, but Israel and the Israeli lobby does not accept that. Obama insisted to designate him, and in 2009 he said that there must be a sort of separation between American foreign policies and the Israeli policies. But Obama himself in 2010 said that there should be no such separation between these two, and that America should not be an honest mediator. No, America should be have sides or be with Israel. During his second mandate, Kerry made a lot of attempts and put a lot of pressure until he had convinced two parties to go to the negotiation table from end of July last year to the end of April this year. Kerry was shocked by the Israeli stubbornness and who refused everything, every proposition, and the stubborn Israeli was always stronger than the determination of the American determination, and because it has big alliances and coalitions to such extent that even the Congress, Obama invited Netanyahu to present a speech against Obama inside the Congress, and such a way that but Obama said that we can no longer defend Israel. Kerry said that Israel might become an apartheid state. Martin Indyk, who was he said that Israel bears the responsibility of the collapse of negotiations, but all that did not push Israel to make any compromises or accept any idea on to stop its settlement activities. Obama began strong, but he was under pressure, and now Obama wants to try again, and now that and Obama who then will be a lame duck soon, and the Palestinian dream of counting on the American position will stay will ever be just a dream, because the United States is partial and takes parts with Israel strategically speaking, and no matter what Biden and Kerry say, because Biden had said that your policies are leading to the death of our soldiers. Nevertheless, Israel has a very big weight in USA policies, well as the Arabs the Israelis can blackmail the American politicians. The Arabs cannot do so. That's why we'll always wait, will be always goes in this vicious circle from one administration to other, and no pressure can be put on Israel unless there would be an agreement between the two parties in the United States to reach a settlement for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Thank you, Dr. Osama. Yes, it is like a revolving door, and we have to find a way as Arabs to break this equation. Our third paper is for Haifa Zangana, an Iraqi writer. She will be talking about using soft power after the American withdrawal from Iraq. She is a well-known Iraqi journalist, human rights activist, and feminist activist, and she used to be an advisor to the United Nations, has many publications to her name. 15 minutes for you, Haifa. Good morning, and please bear with me a little bit. The slides will be in English. I will be speaking in Arabic, so there will be moving from one language. This is part and parcel of my hyphenated identity, maybe. My paper this morning is very long. I'll not have time to deliver it all. It's just a continuation of the work I have been doing during the years of American occupation of my country, and I was interested in the applications of American strategy in Iraq, particularly from the point of view of women's rights and activists and civil society organizations, and also to try and examine how successful or not they have been. I will use some English terminology, and I am a novelist by nature, so sometimes I may not use these terms as you imagine. The use of what is known as soft power in Iraq, which started in 2003 and continues until today. I will give 3 or 4 examples as case studies. I'll try and follow them since the day they were implemented until now, and maybe I'll choose one particular example to focus on because it's related to what I do. The 2 agreements between Iraq and the United States were signed in 2008 in the Bush era. These are the 2 states of the forces agreements, or SOFA, which deals with the issue of providing immunity for American forces, American withdrawal, what number of troops will remain, etc. The number of American forces estimated to be remaining in Iraq until is around 13,500. This is army, security forces, and security personnel, and the security details of the American embassy in Baghdad, which is the biggest American embassy in the world. Also, the second agreement, the Strategic Framework Agreement, which will deal with the situation after the withdrawal of American forces, and it's an open-ended agreement. It has no timeline. This agreement, which is currently now, the Iraqi side persistently wants to implement it, especially in the military side, and Noor al-Maliki specifically. The Americans seem to be a bit hesitant. 7 joint coordination committees have been established. I think these are similar to coordination between the United States and Israel. They cover these joint coordination committees, cover political affairs, diplomatic cooperation, security and defense cooperation, energy cooperation, law enforcement. These are all at the heart of Iraqi society, Iraqi government, Iraqi state, also technology, environment, transportation, trade, finance. Also, a committee was established to oversee everything, was headed by Condoleezza Rice on the American side and Noor al-Maliki on the Iraqi side. Condoleezza Rice considered this as a real step towards consolidating um, uh, the agreements. These committees, or one of them or a few of them, meet on monthly basis. So therefore, I don't personally believe in the myth that the Americans have withdrawn from Iraq. They may have, the ones in military uniform may have left, but the civilian ones are still there and they are having a say in almost every aspect of Iraqi life. The strategy which was formed, I'll cover the entire period of the occupation. At the beginning, hard power was in order. They had their forces, they had their military bases. They wanted to stay in Iraq for God knows how long and turn Iraq into a model for the rest of the area. They used to apply punishment to people, arrest people without any proper charges. Massacres were committed in Al-Haditha, in Al-Qa'im. Also to practice torture and also justify it. They used to say, is it just waterboarding or is it just to extract information? So they implemented a new discourse about torture. What we know of facts in international law, now we saw different definitions to try to find some leeway to practice torture. What happened in Fallujah, shake and bake policy to kill the fighters there and wage military campaigns which were the largest in American history after Vietnam. Some of these practices are still there, but at a smaller level. Also, in these years, the last 13 years, in fact, the lines, the bordering lines are blurred. They try to win the hearts and minds of people, as they say, but anyway, the second point is COIN or counterinsurgency, which is a terminology, a rather old one, but they developed it by David Petraeus, who became as the military governor of the Mosul or Nineveh province. Maybe it is what Petraeus did in Mosul was considered as a success story of American policy of anti-terrorism, and compared to what's happening now in Mosul, maybe should make Petraeus rethink that strategy and what he used to say about successes. And also the American and Petraeus was also was clever in finding eye-catching phrases and things. He used to say that the sooner you get an Iraqi face on things, the better off you are, and he used to try to convince the world that the Iraqis are on his side. The second point is money is ammunition. But of course, he never told us where he was getting the money from. It was Iraqi money, and it was the same money which was reserved for Iraq by the UN. It was released and handed over to the American military command to implement what they called SERP, Commanders Energy Reconstruction Program. So he had access to vast amounts of money in order to gain Iraqis to work for him. The third point is the media. A number of Iraqi journalists used to be employed to. They never wrote any copy. In fact, they only sort of made their names hired by the Americans for American copy to be published in under their name to fight terrorists and killers, and there was no resistance. It was terrorism, and to attack the Sunni Muslims. There were TV stations, radio stations established and utilized for this purpose. This SERP Commander's Emergency Reconstruction Program, quite a mouthful, established the corruption which is currently prevalent in Iraq. They used to engage people in businesses and contracts, and always they used to pay them in cash, no receipts, no invoices, no supervision, no nothing. Nobody knew whether there were real projects being implemented or not. There was no supervision. Later on, we discovered that millions, billions of dollars of our money had gone down the drain. The other point was engage the women. They wanted women. Now you have an Arabic slide in front of you. This interest in women goes back to the days before the American occupation. The American administration and the British government wanted to use women as a face to beautify the occupation. When everybody realized that the question of weapons of mass destruction was a myth, there was no such a thing, they exaggerated the role of women to portray the struggle as one for the women's rights in Iraq. So they started employing women to take pictures with Tony Blair and American leaders in London and Washington. And there were women, on the other hand, who spent decades in the struggle for human rights. Nobody paid them any attention. They only picked certain individuals. They took photos with them, and they floated these pictures only in attempt to convince people that this is what I call colonial feminists. They try to justify occupation. These women utilize women's rights issues and to justify occupation of their country. They were rewarded with being ministers. They gave them ministerial posts and membership of parliament and other rewards. Also, using women is part of the American manual in counterinsurgency, because they say their discourse or narrative is most fighters are men, so therefore they leave their women folk behind to run the family affairs. So if you influence their women, you can put an end to this insurgency. It's as if that Iraqi women are not the cornerstone and the nucleus of the family and society, as if they live on another planet. And they think just by paying some women some money, they'll buy off the rest of Iraqi women. These initiatives, in fact, can be categorized in 4 main projects. Some of them are still being used until today. In the period from 2005 to 2008, Iraqi Women's Advocate Initiative, which is an initiative by the American Army and the Engineers Corps. they adopted, or they appointed an Iraqi woman to head this project. The second one is an offshoot of the first initiative, which is called Iraqi Businesswomen. The third project, which continues until today, is the Iraq Education Initiative, which is being supervised directly by Noor al-Maliki and his office in 2009 to send 12,000 American students to study, and mostly to the United States, some to Canada and the UK. Billions of dollars were spent on this. The tragedy here is the ones who destroyed the education in Iraq. 80% of schools, colleges, universities were destroyed by the American occupation itself. So therefore, we are paying them to destroy our education and our future, it seems. Finally, and this is still ongoing, and it's officially adopted by the American embassy. They consider it a prime investment in Iraq. They call it Al-Nahrain Center for Strategic Studies. They supervise National Defense University and other associated colleges, all to deal with issues relating to security and national security, and the activities are coordinated by this center. I go back to the question of 2 minutes I have. Okay. You will lose if you don't allow me to continue. This is an important thing. The project, Petraeus established this. He established some sort of a zone. This reminds me of Vietnam, when they took some South Vietnamese people and placed them in villages to defend American forces, so that when there is an attack by resistance forces, these South Vietnamese will get the bullets first. They started these industrial zones, Iraqi-based industrial zones, around 14 American bases, including Nasser base. They built some sort of little shops and things in the vicinity of the air base, so that when the Iraqi resistance used to shell these bases, these Iraqis will get the fire first, and then they use that in their propaganda to say that the resistance is attacking and harming Iraqis and not the Americans. Secondly, Women's Advocate Initiative, which was the Gulf Region Division. They contracted a lady called Azza Hummadi. She is an Iraqi lady who used to live in America, and she was partner of Ahmed Chalabi in the Iraqi National Congress and getting aid for Stanley Baker Hill, which is a main contractor with the American Army. I think the contracts with Stanley Baker Hill were worth $1 billion, I'm told. This was aimed at empowering women to strengthen its position in society, to compete with men in order to win contracts with the American Army. So the idea, as was put to the public, was to provide services for the American occupying army in Iraq and not to serve Iraqi society. And also, of course, they told us that they were trying to build democracy in Iraq. You've noticed that the American discourse was ranging from feminist discourse to empowering women, establishing democracy. When all of this failed, they started saying that we are using this for the good of the country. And of course, these are all documented statements by Azza Hummadi and others in interviews. The American administration and American army considered that the failure or the lack of success of their project and their ability to attract only a very small number of women, and of course the figures they published give the impression that there was a real economic boom in Iraq, but in fact the statistics show that one individual woman managed to secure 80 contracts. In fact, the total number of women who were awarded contracts was not more than 20, but the figures they published publicly gave a different picture. The reason why they failed was three. First of all, religion. These people have a different religion. Secondly, it's a different culture. They behaved as if Iraqi women have not taken part in modern Iraq for the last 90 years. We had women ministers. They contributed to regenerating the entire Arab nation. So, and now they started saying the project failed because these people belong to a different religion, different culture, and their civilization is different. I'll conclude by saying that one of the things that the American army presented as a success story and published in Iraq in the White House to all American army corps as one of the projects they considered a success story. I'll show you a short clip. It's only for 1 minute. I'll leave you with it. But before I leave you is to say that the failure of the Iraqi project, the military project in Iraq, due to, first of all, Iraqi resistance, and secondly, the entire Iraqi society resisted, not just one faction. I think the American administration confused the desire by the Iraqi people to get rid of a dictatorial regime, and they confused that with thinking that the Iraqis will accept their occupation. This was wrong. All what they used by way of soft power or hard power or smart power, these are doomed to failure because they forget one thing. There is an Iraqi people living on Iraqi land. They believe in their past, present, and future. I'll leave you with this short clip. Thank you.
Today we're celebrating the opening of this. Today we're celebrating the opening of this web press, where we will be seeing 50, probably 1,000 copies from the newspaper for all the victory base. This is a business that is owned by a woman, 100%, and this is an Iraqi woman who has invested $1.5 million in this project. She's very proud, and so we are too. We see now women more into business. During the regime, women weren't able, or in fact, all people weren't able to work with foreigners. They have to be part of the Ba'athist. So now it's more free.
And you can tell that the lady is in charge of this with all the beautiful flowers.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Haifa, for this wonderful presentation on how to use soft power I just want to point out two things just for the sake of comparison. This they call this the victory establishment, as this was one of the most productive establishments in Iraq, and it was amongst the first that the American forces targeted to destroy it. And secondly, one of the most important aspects of Iraq's successful technology that Iraq produced its own AWACS system, which was done in the 80s. Compare that as a achievement to a printing press now in 2010. Now we have with us Dr. Ramadani from Nahrain University, and Dr. Mazen Ramadani is a pioneer in future studies and political studies in Iraq. And it may not be an exaggeration. I lived through this personally. He was the one behind initiating this discipline formerly as dean of the Saddam University, now Nahrain University. He holds an MA and PhD from Freiburg in Germany. Dr. Ramadani, the floor is yours. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's my pleasure to meet with you, and first, again, I would like to thank the Arab Center for this kind invitation. I will
And what I say will be in line with those who are we call the futurists. That's why I might be speaking a bit different than the others and what that you heard so far. My paper is very detailed. I cannot cover it all. That's why I will speak according to the summarized method. The paper speaks of a problem that there are so many papers that have studied this topic, but none of them have pinpointed what will be the future of the American policies regarding Iraq. The paper is based on a basic assumption that the American role in Iraq has been decided in the past and the future, what America had done in the past, and this will affect the American dealing with Iraq in the near future or mid-term future, let's say from now to 2 decades to come. And that's why in 2022, when we will be in 2022, we will be facing a specific kind of American foreign policy regarding Iraq that define the Iraqi-American relationship. I'm assuming that we are now in 2022, and that's why the question is, what is the situation that will Americans face in Iraq? To prove this central assumption, I will ask 3 questions about the 3 dimensions of the time. The first question is the past of the present, which ends in 2003 with the year of the American occupation of Iraq. The second question will be about the present of the future, which begins starting from 2003 to 2011, which is the year of the so-called military American withdrawal from Iraq. The third question is about the future of the present, which begins from 2012 to end in 2022. First question is about how was the foreign American policies regarding Iraq until 2003 and why. And the second question is about how did this policy become until 2011 and why. And the third question, which is the central one, is what's the possibility of this policy, how will it be in 2022? Uh, of course, I based this on one of the papers about the future, which is called a methodology called the scenario of building scenes. I understand this methodology as follows: that it expresses a scientific interpretation that uses imagination and science as a way to understand the alternative scenes and situations that might be we might see in the future on the basis of the past and the present. I will not go into the details of the first and second question, but I only say that as for the first question, that's to say the past of the present until 2003, the American policy again, regarding Iraq until 2003, from the end of the 19th century to 2003, in fact, witnessed three stages. The first stage, which is extended until 1968, from the creation of the Iraqi state in 1921 until 68. The American policies witnessed three stages. One, the first one, the restricted cooperation from 1921 to 1968, and then the stage of the extended conflict from 1968 to 2003. This extended conflict is based on a clear contradiction between the American project's interest and Iraqi project's interest. The American institutions saw in Iraq as the main challenge of its project in the Arab Gulf and the Middle East in general. Iraq, on the other hand, saw in United States of America as the main obstacle before its national and nationalist pan-Arab project. Because of this contradiction, the United States tried to contain Iraq by two different ways. The first way was which combined soft, intelligent power and hard power, and led to prevailing the hard power by using the war one two times in 1991 and in 2003. So the period that ended in 2003 was a period of acute conflict between the United States and Iraq, and the details can be read in my paper. As for the period after the occupation, there's an opinion that is spreading all over the world now that the occupation and invasion of Iraq is a dangerous precedent because it was made outside the international legitimacy, and it was an aggressive act by excellence. The definition of General Assembly of United Nations of the aggression in its first article is well applied on American invasion of Iraq. In addition to that, this occupation led to a major change in the nature of relationship between the United States and Iraq. After being the challenge or the main rival of United States, the United States became, after the occupation and the invasion, the country that draws the present and the future of this country. I don't want to go into the details of this period. Haifa had done that, and I agree with her totally. But it's useful just to say that the experience with the United States until the so-called the military withdrawal was based on three pillars, political one, an economic one, and a military one. The first one wanted to market Iraq to the region on the domino theory that it is a democratic country. The example of which should be spread all over the country region, and the military base military was its geopolitical position, and the economic one's the petrol. In fact, the foreign policy of any country is just like any other foreign policy in all countries of the world. That's to say, these are policies that can be changed, that they're changeable. On the foreign policies, changes are simple and frequent, unlike internal policies. That's why one cannot say that foreign policies cannot be changed. But scientifically speaking, one cannot say also that foreign policies are static and cannot, that's to say, changes does not cancel continuity. That's to say, if we look into history, we find that the historical, big major historical events did not cancel the continuation of some phenomena. For example, the revolutions, the conflicts, and the wars did not cancel the conflicts and difference between the different countries despite the changes that took place. Nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen, the vision that is based on understanding things that they represent either a continuation of things or changing of things, this understanding has many shortcomings. It has shortcomings because it expresses a vision that it looks into things and their contradiction, either white or black. No, things are not white and black. Life has different colors. As life has different colors, also the future has different colors. The future cannot be seen through one scene only. No, the future is open, varied, different with different scenes, and consequently it is linked to different alternative or substitute scenes. The paper is based on three approaches, scenes. The scene of continuity, that's to say, the position of Iraq in the American foreign policy will continue until 2022. The second scene is the scene of change, which assumes that Iraq's state position in American policy will have a setback in 2022. The third scene is the scene that brings together continuity and change at the same time. That's why the American foreign policy regarding Iraq in 2022 will be associated to the factors of continuity and change at the same time. And I think the third scene is the most probable in my opinion. The first scene is based on an assumption, a basic assumption, that the future is a directional continuation of the factors that built this same scene in the past. The scene says that the factors that were effective will continue to be so until 2022. But this scene does not end or cancel the fact that the American-Iraqi relationship will not be static or difficult and will not resist the differences in and conflict of interest between the two. Let's say the relationship between the two countries, this in spite of the continuity of its importance, might have see or witness some contradictory interests, and we know that the international policy, international politics, even the dependencies in relations might have or contain some differences in policies and interests. In my attempt to prove these scenes, I made three levels of analysis. Iraqi factors, American factors, internal, external, and regional factors. As for the regional factors, I focused on four major powers: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And we will see how these four regional forces or powers deal with each scene. The Iraqi factors, which lead to the first scene, are distributed on three elements, which are the economic element and the elements related to geopolitical position of Iraq and to the element of the military reality of Iraq. And in a quick way, I would like just give just some short points because I only have 15 minutes. The economic aspect is related to petroleum. It is to the extent that was said that the American occupation of Iraq was because of petroleum, but petroleum is not the only element in Iraq, but also because Iraq needed imports and investments. As for the Iraq's position, geopolitical position, this is very important element because we know that the geographic position of any country affects the capability of each country to act or to do something, and it also determines its economic and other parts of it. But some people say that the military doctrines might cancel this. This is not true. The Iraq's geographic position affects both sides. What we call the injustice of geography, and this, as we call it, and then this is that's the negative aspect of geography, and there's also the positive aspect of geography. The negative aspect of geography is related to the fact that when Iraq is weak, the neighboring countries would use this weakness of Iraq to affect its internal and external movement. Turkey and Iran in particular have always used this Iraqi geographic weakness. As for the positive aspect of geography, the different countries who have an interest in the region might use Iraq's geographic position in a good way, including USA, and this is proved by history, in fact. As for the military needs, Iraqi military needs, the occupation did not build Iraq militarily. The head of staff, Iraqi heads of staff, said in a recommendation to the head of the government not to accept or approve the withdrawal of American military because Iraq will not be able to defend its borders until 2020. And consequently, Iraq needed and still needs, in fact, arms from United States and from the United States because the Iraqi or the so-called Iraqi army has adopted the American military doctrine, and the Americans, the occupiers, in fact, destroyed all the military equipment and weapons of Iraq so that So Iraq becomes dependent on United States and the military aspects. This is, of course, in line with United States need to export its weaponry and arms to a country that needs it. Iraq's being near or close to American interests makes the relationship between the two countries in line with a closed triangle. The closed triangle means that Iraq needs regional support. Iraq is not ready to bother USA by any policies that are not approved by USA and that also need support. This close triangle makes the Iraqi rulers not capable to have their own opinion in their relationship with the USA. Yesterday I spoke of Bismarck when commented on the Tunisian, Moroccan, Arab-American relationships, and this also is applicable on American-Iraqi relationships. That's to say, the Americans have made Iraq's needs in such a way that Iraq cannot but cooperate with the United States. As for the American situation inside and outside, we consider that the end of the Cold War had led to the fact that the United States got out of this Cold War and sat on the top of the international pyramid, and this was a historical moment for the United States, and this can be seen in several articles such as what Fukuyama and Anderson and others wrote about this. We also cannot deny that objectively the United States does have some capabilities and capacity that makes it a major power economically, militarily, and knowledge-wise all over the world. So now I jump to the second scene, which is based on the main assumption. This is the assumption of change, that the negative effects of the occupation years on the different parts of Iraq and Iraqi life are not in line with the American interest, and this led to a sort of setback of the importance of Iraq as an ally of the United States, and consequently a setback of Iraq in the American foreign policy, and led to a relationship that is in line with these outcomes. That's why the scene of change is the contradiction or the contrary of the strategy that we spoke of. And the general logic of this scene does not put an end to the effect of the negative aspects of the American, internal, and regional that go around this scene. The Iraqi elements are the political failure, the economic failure, and the security failure. As for the internal and external American situation, in fact, America's being on the top of the pyramid does not mean the United States of America will not, just like other countries or major powers, will not try to continue to sitting at the top of the international pyramid. But what might stop them from doing so, or might put an end to that, is that there must be some structural disequilibrium in this structure. We know that the United States is a major power economically, militarily, but there are some disequilibrium. There are some differences and problems inside these elements that might lead to shortcutting or to ending this position that the United States is occupying at the top of the international pyramid, and consequently that's why most of the countries of the world, of the South especially, try to put an end to their dependence on the United States, and As for the regional elements in Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel, and Turkey, if in the first scene we saw that all this country called for enhancing the Iraqi-American relations, and the scene of change, we find that things change, and these countries will be worried and concerned about the outcome of this American-Iraqi relationship and its deterioration, because this deterioration will lead to the intervention of Iran in Iraq's internal affairs and external affairs. The third scene is the one that brings together all the factors that lead to the first scene and to the second scene, which we call the scene of the balanced adaptation. That's to say, that that's the factors. This will push the external factors will lead to some contradictory tendencies and approaches. Thank you for your attentive listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ramadani. We have 7 minutes left for discussions. I can take 3 comments or questions only.
أرجو تقديم محمود حمد جامعة القاهرة ودريك في الولايات المتحدة. My first question is to Dr. Bishara. I think your analysis is spot on, and there is always room for change in the U.S. foreign policy toward the Middle East. The question is, for you as someone in the intersection between academia and media, is what can we do to change it? التساؤل الثاني للدكتور بشارة وللدكتور أسامة. هل هناك مصلحة استراتيجية أمريكية حقيقية في حل النزاع العربي الإسرائيلي أو الصراع الفلسطيني الإسرائيلي؟ الدول العربية مشغولة بمشاكلها الداخلية أو مشلولة بمشاكلها الداخلية. المنظمات العربية والإسلامية في الولايات المتحدة لا تقارن بالمنظمات المؤيدة لإسرائيل. أستخدم تعبير المنظمات المؤيدة لإسرائيل أنها ليست منظمات يهودية فقط. الرأي العام العربي كما أشار الاستطلاع الذي أجراه المركز أقل اهتماما من أي وقت مضى بالقضية الفلسطينية. الرأي العام الإسرائيلي يبدو ميالا إلى عدم تقديم أي تنازلات للوصول إلى تسوية سلمية. يعني ما قد يبدو، هذا التساؤل الذي قد يبدو نظريا هنا في هذا السياق قد تم طرحه في الكونسل اون فورين ريليشنز. يعني أنا سمعت ريتشارد هاس وأعضاء آخرين من المجلس في شهرين سابقين يتكلمون أن الولايات المتحدة should reduce its footprint in the region. There is no real American interest to try to exert influence and capital to solve the Arab-Israeli problem. فأنا أود أن أسمع منكما تعليقكم على هذا.
شكرا جزيلا. دكتور زهير.
شكرا دكتور عبدالوهاب. My first question is to Dr. Marwan Bishara. Why did you describe the U.S. as a loser or one of the losers in the Middle East equation? Because this raises the question, what do they want actually? So which they did not get in order to be able to describe them as losers. And second, I'm addressed to Dr. Haifa.
Thank you very much for your presentation. This is fascinating, and this reminds me of the period of occupation and the liberation war in Algeria between 52 and 61, when the French occupiers established the administrative specialist units or the urban specialized units, administrative units. They had the same aims. They too targeted women, and their role to win women over, and you will win the entire society. Dr. Ayad. The gentleman is not using the microphone.
Sorry. For the first two speakers, I want you to speculate with me if you can. Let's assume for the sake of argument, the Israeli lobby disappeared or became very weak. Do you think the US foreign policy will change drastically in that area? It's going to be lovey-dovey? Or the policy will continue
with minor changes here and there, because the US is an imperialistic state, and they have a policy which is more or less the same, whether you talk about it in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia. And I leave the answer to you. Thank you.
Dr. Haas.
Yes, thank you very much. I also would like to address the first two speakers. Thank you for very interesting and solid presentations on the Palestinian issue. My question is, after a century, as you described it, of trying and mostly failing to change American policy and American public opinion to end Israel's occupation, what do you think about engaging directly with Israelis in order to change their policy and their public opinion to end the occupation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. For lack of time, we will give 2 minutes to each speaker to respond. Then we'll have a break after that.
You know, I don't have prescriptions for solutions. But on the basis of very rational strategic considerations, I think the 4 elements I mentioned, which is Israel's strategic posture, Arab strategic weight or leverage, Israel lobby, and the global US national interest, would have to work out in one way or another in order to put that much pressure on Israel in order for it to withdraw from Palestine. And I don't see that happening any time in the near future. I see basically all 4 actually going in the other directions. Now, Israel's strategic importance in the United States has declined. Israel's lobby is not the same, and it's actually splitting. There are 2 lobbies. But the Arab situation is so weak, the Arab strategic weight is so weak, and the Israel national interest is not at all touched in the question of Palestine. Even when General Petraeus said in his testimony to Congress that our troops in Afghanistan and other parts of the Middle East are being threatened because of the tensions in Palestine, Obama tried to use that, but he failed. So even when national security interests were threatened, it was very difficult to change the situation in Palestine. Which takes me to the second question. I actually believe that and the situation on the ground is so complex, and the proximity between Israelis and Palestinians is so close, and the Israeli public opinion is so intransigent today, that I am not recommending anything. I think de facto on the ground, the 2-state solution is finished. It's not my opinion. I think factually, the 2-state solution is already gone. And I think to relaunch it on the basis of some sort of a one-state something, federation, not federation, binational democratic state, where I think will be far more approachable in the United States, because we've seen that before. The United States does believe in democracy, human rights, and so on and so forth, or you can sell that to the American public opinion. And I think the idea with the proximity could allow for a Palestine-Israel to emerge, but I don't think it's going to be in my generation, unfortunately. What will happen if the Israeli lobby pulls out and whatever? You know, I don't think these 4 are to be looked at separately. I think the Israeli lobby is a domestic issue, is an internal issue, but I also think it is part and parcel or related to the question of Israel's importance in the Middle East. So yes, there has been almost a positive correlation between Israel's importance to America and the growth of the Israeli lobby. And I think the less important Israel becomes, the more absurd the Israeli lobby will become in trying to defend Israel's interest against Americans' own national interest. So I think as long as the Israeli lobby and the Israeli importance in the United States continues, I think the question will continue to be the same. Yes, there has been decline, but as I said, that's also related to the other questions of the Arab weight or strategic posture. And I think that is probably in its weakest we've ever seen it. So as American experts continuously tells me, why should the United States do anything, strategically speaking, when you don't posit any strategic weight. And hence, and I heard that before, and I will end with that, I think the idea of Israeli lobby is, by the way, is a silly idea, because the Israel Jewish lobby in the United States is not just a lobby of a foreign government. The Jewish influence in the United States is credited to a successful Jewish community in the United States from 1850 onwards. And it is in conjunction with American evangelicals and other lobbies that come together all to form the Israeli lobby. Having a couple of Palestinians in Washington call themselves lobbyists is not going to add to anything. Why don't Palestinians engage Israelis? I think that's a huge misconception, by the way, there. I think Hamas, even Hamas, not just Fatah, Hamas have been engaging Israelis since 1987, since the mid-80s. You know, during the 80s and the 90s, most of the mayors in a good number of cities in the West Bank were actually Hamas, and they were engaging Israelis every day, even when Hamas does not speak to Israel, does not recognize Israel. But in fact, Hamas mayors have been speaking to Israeli authorities, occupation authorities, for ages. And of course, Fatah have been engaging with the Israelis, and I think that took to nowhere, and that's why they brought the boss. That was they brought the patron, Washington, back into the equation.
شكرا. تفضل دكتور أسامة.
Thank you, Dr. Marwan. Just to address the first question, Dr. Muhammad, I remember yesterday you were talking about why America is less interested in the Middle East. And you answered the question is because of its pivot towards to Asia. I think this can provide an answer here, or can give us one dimension to the answer, where America is very much invested in the Middle East, and it wants to reduce the investment in the Middle East. It's so much consumed in the politics of the Middle East, and because of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's been dragged into the region time and time again. So the way I understand it, that the Obama administration, especially the Obama administration, because they engineered this pivot to Asia, they wanted to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I might differ a little bit here with Dr. Marwan when he spoke about the Petraeus statement or the Petraeus testimony before the US Senate Armed Forces Committee. I think what he said, and which was confirmed before by Biden, the vice president, and then by Robert Gate, when he was the defense minister, is that we will continue to be consumed. Our national interests will continue to be endangered in the Middle East as long as the Arab-Palestinian or the Arab-Israeli conflict is still going on. So this has to come to an end, and I think that's where Obama was coming from when he was speaking about the American national interest in the Middle East. Now, also remember that we're talking about a rising China, we're talking about a rising Russia. America needs also to pivot now back to Europe. But they cannot do that as long as they're still consumed in the Middle East. And when even we thought that America have departed from the Middle East, Iraq brought it back, Benghazi brought it back, and the failure of the so-called Arab Spring also brought back the United States to the region. So I think there is an interest for the United States to solve this. Now, the Israeli lobby, for Dr. Iyad point, I agree with you. There is an imperialistic component into the US foreign policy. If the Israeli lobby and its allies, it's not only, as Dr. Marwan explained, it's not only the Israeli lobby, it has its own allies within the United States. If the Israeli lobby will disappear, what will happen is that we'll see a less biased policy, but the bias will continue to be there. So we shouldn't think that America will just change the nature of its foreign policy just because the Israeli lobby doesn't exist. But as Dr. Marwan explained in his presentation, there is a difference between advocating the existence of Israel and advocating or speaking on behalf of the occupation. So I think we'll see a more balanced policy towards the region. The last point, to David's point, I think one thing that we need to keep in mind, that President Mahmoud Abbas have tried time and time again appealing to the Israeli public opinion He traveled there. He spoke to students. He spoke to religious school students. He met with Israeli. Actually, they advertised in Israeli newspapers. He tried every possible way. What we have to discuss is why Israel is so adamant that it doesn't want to proceed in the peace process, and that's where the Obama administration is coming from. As Dr. Marwan explained, that we are, the two-state solution is dead, in fact. And part of the reason is that the Israelis are not putting any alternative on the table. What do you want? If you don't want a two-state solution, a viable Palestinian state, then you will end up with a one-state solution where the Palestinians, as Kerry hinted, might one day just engage in a civil disobedience, demanding an equal rights, equal citizenship, and a one-state solution. So I think the issue is with the Israeli officials, not with the Israeli public opinion, nor with the American policy, though it's still a biased policy. Thank you.
In the last 2 days, we listened to many ideas. Some of what was said was to describe what's happening in the Arab world, Iraq and Palestine, either as a failure of analysis or a crisis. This is our situation, or mistakes, problems, structural problems sometimes, collateral damage. And when yesterday the American ambassador in Yemen was asked about the alternative to drones, this weapon will be used extensively in the Arab world and the world because of the restructuring of the American army and trying to reduce the losses. He was talking about all what he had to say was to determine the targets better and nothing else. It's as if he has a God-given right to punish us. They no longer see themselves like the policemen of the world, but now they are God's authorized force on earth to kill the rest of it, and the rest of us has to live with it. What we lack is, what we have is, or don't have, is the lack of accountability. What happened in Iraq and others are not collateral damage, they are massacres, they are crimes against humanity, they are documented. International law must be applied. International law is not there to punish us only, and it should punish every country, including superpowers, through the Security Council. International law should be applied equally and not against some Arab and African countries and leave other countries in immunity of punishment. Okay. Thank you very much for your kind attention. This was a very rich session. We go back to our first hypothesis made by Dr. Marwan. There is a question of leverage by the Arabs. This leverage has two manifestations, one inside the United States, and the second in the lack of convincing Israel that there is a counter force to its force. We have a 15-minute break. Please don't make it longer. We don't want to lose time from the next sessions. Thank you.